Good afternoon. This lesson will be on Juliet in the play Romeo and Juliet. We're going to have a little look at her character throughout the play and explore how Shakespeare chooses to portray Juliet. So first of all, there is just a list here of some terms that you should be familiar with, and you might want to pause the video here to do a little bit of additional research. So you know that the play is a tragedy, that is the genre, and we have spoken in previous sessions a little bit about tragedy and the expectations and conventions of tragedy. In terms of context, there are some terms here, so you should know a little bit now about patriarchal society, a society dominated by men. You know as well about the importance of honour and the idea that the men in particular feel the need to defend the family honour. Um, the role of women in society, so women as second class citizens and really seen as possessions, not really presented as women who have any sort of independent thought of their own. And courtly love, which we haven't looked at. Last session we talked about Petrarch and love. Courtly love is another aspect for you to research. We could argue that Romeo is the courtly lover, and it simply means that he takes on this sort of noble form of love, like a knight would admire a woman from afar. She would usually be an unobtainable woman. She may already even be married. And in a sense, when Romeo first falls in love with Juliet, we are presented with this idea that he is the courtly lover. He worships her from afar, and his love seems to make him more of a noble character, more of an enriched character. Traditionally, courtly love, it never goes anywhere. It's never acted upon. It's just a worship from afar, and perhaps Romeo and Juliet, if it had just remained a distant worship, wouldn't have ended in tragedy. But obviously, their passion and their desire wins over, and it unfortunately leads to their demise. Hamartia, hubris, and peripeteia are terms associated with tragedy. Again, we have talked about these before, but a quick recap. A hamartia is a character's fatal flaw. So Juliet's fatal flaw is her absolute dedication to Romeo at all costs. Romeo's is his sort of rash, impulsive behaviour. We could argue that Mercutio's fatal flaw is how he underestimates the feud and he treats it like a joke. Hubris, I'm not sure we've actually defined this one, but hubris is an excess of pride. Now, there are a couple of characters that this applies to. One of those characters is Tybalt. He has a real arrogance and a real self-belief in his skills as a fighter and as a man, and that pride we see in several places in the play, and again it adds to the tragedy, the fact that he feels he has to defend himself. And another key character who we see this with is the friar. um, the friar's arrogance comes from the fact that he believes that he alone can solve this family feud, and actually what he does would be a little bit shocking in the fact that he agrees to marry Romeo and Juliet without the parents' permission. And obviously, it's Juliet's father has that decision over who Juliet should marry. So the friar's behaviour would be quite controversial, but he really believes he's doing it for the greater good. And then again later, when he continues with his plan to fake Juliet's death and bring Romeo back, and he believes that the families will be so glad that they're alive that they'll forget about the feud. Again, his hubris, his pride, kind of propels him forward, his confidence in his own plan, and ultimately it all fails. And we could say that Shakespeare's perhaps poking fun at him in a way as in this religious role, because what we see in his character is that he's very distinctly human at the end of it, and not actually this figure representing God. So there's that aspect to explore, and peripeteia, which is the sudden reversal of fortunes, which we see in Act 3 with the death of Mercutio and Tybalt. We've also talked about Freytag's pyramid, so the 5-act structure. There's some of the technical terms there for you to explore, and character traits and methods. So when we're looking at language, we're looking at imagery. We've already spoken about how Capulet's imagery is often linked to nature when he talks about Juliet. Looking at simile and metaphor, Romeo's speeches are often filled with similes and metaphors to describe Juliet as a beautiful beacon of light and as an angel, and so on. So here we go, Juliet. So Juliet, like Romeo, makes the transition from an innocent adolescent to a responsible adult during the course of the play. Now it's really important to remember that Juliet is only 13 years old, so she really is the sort of symbol of innocence, somebody who has her whole life ahead of her, and she becomes a victim of this feud. So Shakespeare really uses her character to show how dangerous this kind of toxic feud can be and how it can impact on anybody in society, even the youngest, most innocent of characters like Juliet. Now, I suggest as we go through this video that you pause and make notes. Again, you can see there are words in bold, and you might want to copy down some of the quotations. So Juliet is kind of forced to mature too quickly. The emphasis throughout the play is on Juliet's youth, and despite her growing maturity, establishes her as a tragic heroine. Celestial imagery is used. So celestial imagery means associated with the heavens, the stars, the sun, the sky. Juliet is referred to by Romeo as the sun. You know, in that metaphor, Juliet is the east and Juliet is the sun. He also calls her a bright angel, and in the prologue, she's revealed to be a star-crossed lover, implying that fate is bringing these characters together. And although they are doomed to die, it's fate that they should come together to bring about the end of the feud. So at the start of the play, Juliet is presented as really the traditional Elizabethan girl. She's quiet and obedient. She possesses an inner strength that enables her to have maturity. Act 1, Scene 2, we're introduced to Juliet on stage, and it explores the theme of youth versus age, and the difference in attitudes between the nurse, Lady Capulet, and Juliet towards love and marriage. So we've spoken previously about this theme of love and marriage. We know that women married really young, and that women younger than Juliet, so younger than 13, would already be married and have children. Juliet, when they bring up the marriage and the fact that at this party she might meet her future husband, Juliet says that marriage is an honour that she has not dreamed of. So it's not something she's thought about, but she's really obedient, and she says to her mother that she will look to like. So she wants to please her parents, so she'll look at Paris and she'll hope to like him, but it's never even crossed her mind before. So again, it shows her innocence. Now, in contrast, you have the nurse, who has this really uninhibited attitude towards sex. She makes lots of sexual references and rude jokes, and it helps to show the class difference as well. You know, she's lower class servant character, and the fact that she makes all of these sexual jokes and references again just helps to highlight Juliet's innocence. And as we said in previous lesson, Mercutio is a foil for Romeo. So Romeo is the romantic, whereas Mercutio is the sort of more lusty character who sees love as a sport. In this relationship between the nurse and Juliet, the nurse is the comic character who is a foil for Juliet. So she helps to create that contrast between Juliet's youthful innocence and the nurse's coarser character who's more mature and who's experienced more hardship and so on. So the nurse helps to emphasize the innocence of Juliet. The nurse also acts as a friend to Juliet, a confidant character. And again, in terms of context, the nurse would have been much more of a maternal figure than Lady Capulet herself. The nurse raised Juliet from a baby, and she was her wet nurse, which means that she breastfed Juliet. Again, by modern standards, this is a really weird concept, but in the time period, this was quite normal. So Lady Capulet, obviously a higher class woman, would leave the childcare really to this nurse who would have looked after Juliet from being a baby. So there's a real maternal bond between Juliet and the nurse, and it's a really important relationship to focus on. So the nurse reminisces about Juliet being weaned and learning to walk, and anticipates Juliet's move towards sexual maturity. For example, in her account of when Juliet fell over learning to walk, the nurse recalls that her own husband had noted quite boldly, "Thou wilt fall backwards when thou hast more wit." So it's a sexual joke about how as women grow older and grow mature, they fall over when they're little, like falling over in learning to walk, but when they grow up, they fall backwards, meaning falling backwards into bed. So it's a sexual reference. So there's this kind of smutty humour that Shakespeare uses to break up the tension of the play. So such comments help depict Juliet as an adolescent on the threshold of womanhood, while reinforcing the idea that Juliet has been objectified as a marriage commodity since birth. So this is just her destiny in Elizabethan society, that she's been raised, and she is sort of this possession of her parents, and now she will be married off into an arranged marriage that will be more for social status than for love. But Juliet's accepting of this because this is just the norm in Elizabethan society. When her mother suggests that she marries Paris and that Paris is rich and good looking, Juliet responds with, "I'll look to like, if looking like him move, but no more deep will I in dark my eye." So she shows her obedience here. She wants to please her parents. It also shows her emotional maturity because she's made up her own mind that she cannot marry someone whom she does not love, rejecting both her mother's and the nurse's materialistic and sexual views of love. So she says she'll try to like, but that's all she can promise at this stage. So obviously at the party, it isn't Paris who catches her eye, but it's Romeo, and she just falls instantly in love. So we have this theme of love at first sight. She is prepared to defy her parents to marry Romeo. Now this would be quite shocking for the Elizabethan audience because Julia is disobeying her parents, but as a woman in this time period, that would be really shocking because obviously women were second class citizens. Sorry, hang on. So we see a different side to Juliet when she's with Romeo. We see this a witty character. She's really quick-witted with her responses to him when he's making these big declarations of love. Um, she kind of pushes him on the meaning of his words. We also see her absolute loyalty and her strength. You know, she's prepared to give up everything for Romeo. So when Romeo and Juliet kiss at the feast, Juliet teases Romeo for using popular imagery of love poetry to express his feelings and for kissing according to convention rather from the heart. It kind of shows that she has this maturity within her, whereas Romeo's more prone, I think, at the start to sort of empty words and saying what he thinks is the right thing to say. And Juliet actually encourages Romeo to speak more honestly and from the heart. So in the balcony scene of Act 2, Scene 2, Juliet is aware that their love is dangerous, really. She knows she's aware of the foolhardiness of the love. She says it is too rash, too unadvised, too sudden. So again, we see intelligence here. She's aware of the dangers of their relationship. But again, it's part of her hamasha. Her devotion is so complete to Romeo that she ploughs on anyway. This sense of rushing headlong sums up their love and relationship. Yet, despite her premonition that it's dangerous, she is the one that suggests that they marry. In the scene, we often see Shakespeare using light and dark imagery. It's used to describe the blossoming of their romance. Juliet often compares Romeo to the stars. Romeo compares Juliet to the sun. Whenever they meet, it's at nightfall. It's under the cover of darkness. They're never seen together in the day. So again, it helps to show that their love is forbidden, and perhaps it symbolises that their love can never really exist in Verona because it would never be approved of by their parents because of this ridiculous feud. So again, it helps to emphasise the tragedy of the play. So so the constant darkness is like an allusion to the forbidden nature of their love. So in Act 3, when Juliet learns of Tybalt's death, initially she has these really conflicting feelings. She's torn between her love for her husband and her loyalty towards Tybalt, her dead cousin. And she questions Romeo's character. She uses a lot of oxymorons to show she's not sure if she really knows him at all. Um, she calls him a beautiful tyrant, a dove-feathered raven. She implies he's a wolf in sheep's clothing, that he's like a beautiful book on the outside, a beautiful flower with a serpent hiding within. Um, she has this idea that maybe he looks good on the outside, but has this rotten core. And she questions Romeo really briefly, and then really suddenly she says, shall I speak ill of him that is my husband? And she really tells herself off because she realizes that Tybalt is aggressive and it was probably Tybalt who caused the fight. So it shows that although she has this momentary conflict, that actually her devotion and loyalty to Romeo remains unshaken. So, in Act 3, Scene 5, Romeo and Juliet spend their first and only night together as a married couple, again under the cover of darkness to show that their love is forbidden. As dawn breaks, they are forced to part for fear of being discovered, and their love and their marriage would be exposed. Now, Romeo bids farewell, and as he leaves, there's this moment of foreshadowing. Okay, so Juliet stands at the window and she has a premonition. She looks down and she says, "O God, I have an ill divining soul. Methinks I see thee now, thou art so low as one dead in the bottom of a tomb. Either my eyesight fails or thou lookst pale." Again, it's creating this really tragic moment because the audience already know from the prologue that they are going to die. And the next time Juliet sees Romeo, it will be when he is dead in the tomb. So it creates this sympathy for her character and this idea that fate has them on this path that they can't escape. And it's a little bit of a bleak message for humanity, the idea that perhaps you don't have that much control over your own life. How much is free will and how much is just pre-decided by some higher power or fate. So in Act 3, Scene 5, we see that the Capulet is putting his foot down. Now, we talked about this in the Capulet lesson. He's gone from being the father who wants to hold back on this marriage to suddenly wanting to rush it through because he wants some happiness for the family, but he also wants to reassert his patriarchal rule. Tybalt's disobeyed him, and now Tybalt is dead, so he's going to use his daughter's wedding to reassert himself and to reassert his authority. Now, when Juliet refuses to marry, obviously we see Capulet threaten to cast her aside, to throw her out into the streets, and she feels completely lost and betrayed here. Her mother turns her back on her. Um, she begs the nurse, what should she do? And the nurse even tells her, you should marry this Paris. By comparison, Romeo is a dishcloth compared to Paris. Now, this is a real moment for Juliet. This is again the climax of the play, Act 3. Act 3, thinking about Freytag's pyramid. Juliet feels completely isolated at this point, and the person she trusts most in the world, other than Romeo the nurse, is telling her to marry somebody else. And I think she feels really alone because she realizes that the nurse doesn't understand her love for Romeo. And she says, if all else fails, myself have power to die. So we're getting the suggestion straight away that she will commit suicide rather than marry Romeo, partly because of her devotion to Romeo, but also because of her faith. She's very religious and she's not going to commit bigamy by marrying somebody else. So in the eyes of God, Juliet would rather commit suicide than break her religious marriage vows. So in Act 4, the friar, and considering again, he's supposed to be a religious figure, he proposes that she fakes her own death rather than enter into this marriage with Paris. And it increases Juliet's character as the tragic heroine. She's really afraid. She says, "My dismal scene I need must act alone." She's frightened. She even contemplates whether the friar might just be going to kill her for real, because he's gone too far into this plan and he's made all of these mistakes. So she's really fearful. But we also see her bravery because she does go ahead. She does go ahead with it. There's some references here as well about birth and death, and birth and death are repeated images throughout the text. We see that motif all the time of birth and death together. So it says it is on the one, the family tomb becomes a symbol of both birth and death. It is on the one hand the womb from which Juliet should emerge alive and hope be born anew. But first of all, obviously, she has to fake her death to get into the vault. Before her rebirth with Romeo, which obviously doesn't happen. So, in terms of Juliet's character, we see her loyalty to Romeo and her absolute devotion. We see her moving from childhood into adulthood. We see her moving from being quite the traditional Elizabethan girl to actually being a more independent, forward-thinking woman with her own views and her own thoughts and her own feelings. And actually, her death is really tragic, and it helps to highlight that Shakespeare is criticising this violence in society. Um, these violent delights have violent ends. Juliet's death reminds us that this violence is consuming Verona and destroying innocence. When Juliet awakes in the tomb and finds Romeo dead, She's obviously heartbroken, and again we see the friar. He's arrived, but he's arrived too late, and we see him saying to her, "Look, run away. I'll hide you in a nunnery." I guess we see his panic and how distinctly human his behavior is, because he's thinking about himself and not getting caught for all of the mistakes that he's made. But and he's afraid and he runs away and leaves Juliet. And it shows again, it highlights Juliet's bravery. She stays alone in the tomb with her dead husband and her dead cousin. And she kills herself with Romeo's dagger, and she uses this famous metaphor, um, happy dagger. She personifies the dagger and kills herself. Now, her death can be seen as quite a great sacrifice, because death by dagger was seen as a noble way to die, and it's a really tragic end for Juliet. I compiled a list of quotations again, which I will scroll through, and you can obviously pause and make notes on. They are in chronological order, um, roughly chronological order. There's some missing from Act 1, Scene 2, which were earlier on the slides, but they show different aspects of Juliet. So I'll just run through a few, and then at the end of this presentation, I would like you to create a character profile for Juliet, similar to what you did for Romeo. So you can just simply do a collage, a timeline, a profile. You could do diary entries, or you could do the Facebook page. It's completely your choice how you present this work. So, when she meets Romeo, we see the use of religious imagery, and palm to palm is Holy Palmer's kiss. It's part of Romeo and Juliet's teasing and courtship. When she finds out that Romeo is from the enemy family, she says, "My only love sprung from my only hate." So we have this real conflict of love and hate, which is obviously a key theme within the play. Um, O Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo? Deny thy father and refuse thy name. Oh, if thou wilt not, but be sworn my love, and I'll no longer be a Capulet. Like Romeo, we see her absolute devotion here. She's prepared to give up everything. She's prepared to sacrifice her family and her name to be with Romeo. So that we see her hamasha there, don't we? Her fatal flaw is her absolute devotion. We see this sensible and we see this wisdom here. What's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other would still smell as sweet. Um, it highlights that to Juliet, Romeo is just a beautiful person, but why does the name matter so much? And again, we have this irony that it's one of the youngest characters in the play who speaks with the most wisdom. So her death again helps to highlight that the older generation perhaps need to learn from this, and the idea of not holding the grudge, not judging somebody by their name but by their actions. And that's what Juliet is doing. She sees Romeo's good nature, and actually he would have been a good partner for Juliet. She asks Romeo not to swear by the moon. She says it's too rash, sorry, that's a different quote. So she says to Romeo that their love is too rash, too unadvised, too sudden, too like lightning. So she's really aware that their relationship is kind of crazy and sudden and instant and dangerous, but she plows ahead with it anyway. And I was just using a different quote. She says, "Do not swear by the moon, the inconstant moon." So when he declares his love, she wants more than just empty words. She wants true sentiment and commitment from Romeo, which again shows her maturity. She compares their love again to a flower. So Romeo was the rose, and now it's this bud of love by summer's ripening breath may prove a beauteous flower when we next meet. So she sees their love like an aspect of nature that will grow and bloom. And again, it highlights the innocence of the characters. Again, another image of nature. Okay, my bounty is as boundless as the sea. My love is deep. The more I give to thee, the more I have, for both are infinite. Shows her absolute love and devotion towards Romeo. And she says, I'll lay and follow thee, my lord, throughout the world. So she's made it clear where her loyalties lie. As she is being forced in Act 3 to marry Paris, she literally begs her father on her knees, "Good father, I beseech you on my knees, hear me with patience, but to speak a word." Um, and obviously, it does not go down well for Juliet. He refuses to listen and threatens to disown her if she does not go through with the wedding. So we see her rage and anger at the end of this scene when she's been cast aside by her mother and her father, and the nurse has given her poor advice. And she says, "O ancient damnation, O most wicked fiend, it is more sinful to wish me thus forsworn, or to dispraise my Lord with that same tongue which hath praised him with above compare so many thousand times. Go counsellor thou, and my bosom henceforth shall be twain. I'll to the friar to know his remedy. If all else fails, myself have power to die. So we see this absolute inner strength from Juliet, that she's determined to remain true to Romeo and would rather die than be without her true knight. There are a few more quotes here between Paris and Juliet, which I'll just scroll past. But basically, it shows Juliet's clever nature, um, because there's quite a tension there as he's trying to show he loves her, and she sort of bounces his words back without making any real commitment to what he's saying. So it's a really clever use of wordplay, creating tension, which shows again Juliet's intelligence for someone so young. And then in Act 4, we see her fear before she takes the drug. You know, what if it be a poison which the Friar have subtly have ministered to have me dead? She's got enough intelligence about her that she realised that this plan is all going sort of terribly wrong. And what if the Friar just kills her to cover his own tracks? But she's so desperate she would rather die than be without Romeo anyway. So she takes the drug. And lastly, a happy dagger. This is thy sheath, their rust, and let me die. So Juliet kills herself with the dagger, and obviously the death of Romeo and the death of Juliet upon discovery brings about the Pyrrhic victory. The families bury the hatchet. Verona is finally at peace, but it's a glooming peace because the sacrifice of these young, innocent characters highlights the problems in society. It highlights the problems with the feud. It highlights the terrible consequences of violence. And it highlights the importance of having good relationships with your children. Um, and obviously, Capulet and Montague learn that lesson, but they learn it too late. So I hope you found this presentation on Juliet insightful. I've kind of covered the whole play. So again, you can pause it, you can watch it back. But these lessons on these characters should hopefully be really reinforcing your knowledge of the text as a whole and the individual characters and their role within the play, how Shakespeare presents them, and what he wants us to learn through them. So I'd suggest you pause this video now and make some notes on Juliet, including some quotations, and consider what we learn through the presentation of Juliet. Thank you for listening.